I'm making 7 different Halloween cupcakes and I'd love to know which one is your favorite. To start, I'm mixing equal parts of Amazing Mold Putty Part A and B to create a mold. To save myself the trouble of sculpting, I'm using the small bottle cap that already has ridges like a cupcake. I'm gently pressing the sides to make sure I get all of the texture of the bottle cap. I'm making the clay I'll be using to fill the mold by mixing tan and white polymer clay. To make the clay look more like vanilla cupcakes, I added some yellow. To form the cupcakes, I pull off a small amount of clay and fill my mold. I'm pushing the ball of clay down to make sure it fills the entire mold, and I'm squeezing the sides to make sure the ridges leave marks. I'm using a toothbrush to create texture for the top of the cupcake. I'll be making 4 varieties of flavors of cupcakes, but I'm using the same color base for each one. I remove the unbaked cupcake using either a sewing pin or knocking it onto my baking plate with a toothbrush. I baked my cupcakes at 275 for 15 minutes. For the vanilla cupcake, I'm using some brown chalk pastels to add some color. I'm concentrating the color on the outer edge of the cupcake, the bottom of the cupcake, and the ridges. To mimic the look of a paper cupcake liner, I'm using a small amount of white acrylic paint to dry brush across the ridges. To transform this cupcake into a Halloween treat, I'm using my blade to cut some thin slices of polymer clay. I added liquid clay to the top of the cupcake to help the unbaked clay stick to the baked base. I'm overlapping strips of clay, making sure to keep some of the cupcake base visible. I'm using my X-Acto knife to cut off the overhang and make it even. I used 2 black balls of clay as eyes to make it look like a mummy. To make a chocolate cupcake, I'm adding some brown acrylic paint and using white acrylic paint for the liner. Remember to let me know in the comments which of the 7 cupcakes is your favorite. I made a tapered snake of white polymer clay and I'm adding it in a spiral on top of the cupcake. I used liquid clay to attach the unbaked clay to the baked cupcake base. I'm using some trash plastic to create a shard of glass. I can't bake the plastic, so I'm leaving an indent and I'll add it back to the cupcake after it's baked. I'm using some liquid clay and red India ink to make a red splatter. I'm using translucent liquid clay throughout this entire project. I'm using a toothpick to add the red liquid clay. I used my heat gun to bake the liquid clay on the trash plastic and glued it onto the cupcake after baking. For a pumpkin flavored cupcake, I'm using some orange paint and white paint for the liner. To make some frosting, I start by chopping up some clay. To make the solid clay light and fluffy, I'm mixing in liquid clay. I'm adding the liquid clay a little at a time to make sure I don't make it too loose. I'm creating a base for my frosting using a little bit of liquid clay and some solid clay. I'm using a toothpick to swirl some of the frosting I made onto the cupcake. I added twisted green and yellow clay to act as a stem. I baked the clay with my heat gun, added a small amount of frosting, and used a silicone tool to create some ridges. I created some spirals of green clay on a sewing pin and baked them with my heat gun. I added the spirals to the cupcake to make it look like a pumpkin. For my next cupcake, I made a chocolate base and used a spiral of brown polymer clay as chocolate frosting. I used balls of white and black clay to make some eyes. I rolled out my clay on one of the thinnest settings on my pasta machine, and I'm using an X-Acto knife to cut out the shape of a bat wing against my metal blade. I'm cutting a mirror image of the bat wing shape on the other side and removing the excess clay. I used my heat gun to bake the bat wings on my metal blade and used some liquid clay to attach them to the cupcake. For my next cupcake, I added some white and gray clay to my blade. I'm using a ball stylus I got at the Dollar Tree to create some indents. I'm using a round cake tip to cut out a circle and removing the excess clay to create a tiny moon. Now I'm mixing some liquid clay into this green clay to create some frosting. I'm adding some of the green frosting to the top of a vanilla cupcake and using a stiff paintbrush to make it look like grass. I'm adding my baked moon of clay to the grass. To make a tiny black cat, I started by making a simple sketch on some mat board. I'm using my ball stylus to add liquid clay to my sketch. I baked the first layer of clay with my heat gun, and now I'm adding a second layer of clay to make the cat more substantial. After baking the cat again with my heat gun, I'm using an X-Acto knife to refine the shape. I'm removing the cat from the mat board and refining the shape some more using some small scissors. I can still see the pencil lines of my sketch, so it's easy to cut any clay that's outside of the lines. The cat is still pretty thin, so I flipped it over and I'm adding liquid clay to the back. I baked the cat one more time using my heat gun for about 30 seconds before painting it black. I used a white gel pen and a green Sharpie to make some eyes. I added the cat to the frosting grass before baking in the oven. For my next Halloween cupcake, I'm using a vanilla base and I cut a circle out of a thin sheet of clay using a toothpaste cap. I cut a slice out of the circle and shaped it into a dome. Next, I'm draping the clay over a small ball of white clay I added to a stick. I'm using a sewing needle to gently coax it into shape. Once I liked the shape, I baked it on the stick using my heat gun. I'm using the orange frosting I created for the pumpkin cupcake as a base. I'm sticking my baked clay ghost into the frosting and I used a Sharpie for the eyes. To make a strawberry flavored cupcake, I'm using some watered down pink paint. Once it has dried, I'm adding some color with a little bit of brown chalk pastel. I'm adding some liquid clay to the cupcake and a small amount of pink clay as a base. I'm using the back of my X-Acto blade to make a line up the middle. I'm rolling a long thin snake of pink clay and using some liquid clay to add it to the top of the cupcake. I start by adding the snake of clay along the line I created and make tight folds along the outside. Then I repeated the design on the other side. I'm using some of the red liquid clay from the shard of glass cupcake to add some color. I finished all of the cupcakes by baking them for 20 minutes at 275, and I used UV resin after baking for any areas I wanted to be shiny. A couple years ago, I tried to make a miniature polymer clay cake and it looked pretty bad, so I'm so happy with how my second attempt at polymer clay food has turned out.